Absurdism begins with a feeling almost everyone knows, though few people name. It is the moment when the world, which normally seems familiar and manageable, suddenly feels strange. It might arrive in grief when someone dies and nothing in the universe seems to acknowledge that loss. It might arrive in boredom when routine stretches on without direction. It might arrive late at night when a person realizes that no matter how hard they work, time will erase everything they do. In these moments, life does not necessarily feel tragic, it feels inexplicable, and that is where absurdism begins. Albert Camus did not invent this feeling, but he gave it a name. He called it the absurd. The absurd is not simply the idea that life is meaningless, it is not nihilism, and it is not despair. It is the tension that arises when a human being, who naturally longs for meaning, confronts a world that does not provide it. People want their lives to make sense. They want their suffering to be justified, their work to lead somewhere, and their existence to form a coherent story. But the universe offers no such story. It continues in silence, indifferent to hopes, fears, or ideals. The absurd lives in that gap. This definition is important because many misunderstand absurdism as a philosophy of pessimism. They assume Camus is saying that nothing matters. In fact, he is saying something more precise and more difficult. He is saying that human beings cannot stop wanting meaning, and the world cannot supply it. The absurd is not a conclusion about the universe. It is a relationship between the human mind and the reality it inhabits. Camus believed that modern people encounter this relationship more often and more painfully than earlier generations. In traditional societies, meaning was provided by religion, custom, and inherited structures. People knew who they were, what was expected of them, and where they belonged. Even suffering could be understood as part of a divine plan. But the modern world has stripped away many of these assurances. Science explains how the universe works, but not why it exists. History reveals endless cycles of violence, but no final justice. Progress produces technology, but not wisdom. The result is a world that functions perfectly well, but offers no ultimate purpose. Absurdism does not begin by declaring that life is meaningless. It begins by noticing that meaning is absent, and it asks what a person should do when they see that absence clearly. One common response is to try to escape the absurd by pretending it does not exist. People fill their lives with distraction, routine, and social expectations. They work, consume, scroll, plan, and repeat. These activities are not evil, but they often function as a way of not thinking too deeply. They keep the question of meaning at bay. Absurdism begins when the question breaks through anyway. Another response is to try to solve the absurd by inventing meaning. This is where religion, ideology, and metaphysical systems often enter. They promise that suffering is part of a greater plan, that history is moving toward redemption, or that death is not the end. Camus calls this move philosophical or metaphysical escape. It restores comfort, but at the cost of honesty. It replaces the world's silence with answers that cannot be verified. A third response is despair. If there is no meaning, one might conclude that life is not worth living. This is where suicide enters Camus's thought. He does not treat it as a moral failing. He treats it as a logical question. If nothing has meaning, why continue? Absurdism is the refusal of all three escapes. It refuses distraction, it refuses false meaning, and it refuses death as an answer. Instead, it chooses to remain in the tension between longing and silence. This is what Camus means when he says that the absurd must be lived. To live the absurd is not to be miserable, it is to be awake. It is to acknowledge that the universe does not justify itself and to continue living anyway. It is to accept that no final explanation will come and to refuse both resignation and illusion. Absurdism is therefore not a philosophy of hopelessness. It is a philosophy of limit. It recognizes that there are things humans cannot have: absolute meaning, eternal purpose, final justice. But it also recognizes what humans do have: the present moment, the capacity for awareness, and the freedom that comes from not being bound by false promises. One of Camus' most radical ideas is that hope, in its traditional form, is an enemy of freedom. Hope always points toward a future where things will finally make sense. It postpones life. It says, not now, but later. Absurdism rejects this postponement. If there is no final meaning waiting, then the only life that exists is the one being lived right now. This is why Camus replaces hope with revolt. Revolt is not anger. It is not violence. It is the decision to live without appeal. To live without appeal means to live without asking the universe to justify itself. It means accepting that there may be no final answer and choosing to live anyway. This revolt creates a new kind of freedom. Without belief in destiny, divine will, or historical necessity, a person is released from the burden of living for something beyond life. They no longer have to sacrifice the present for an imagined future. They are free to live intensely, to experience, to act, and to care, even though nothing lasts. This is where absurdism begins to sound strangely life-affirming. If there is no ultimate meaning, then no single failure can destroy everything. If there is no final judgment, then no moment is wasted by not serving some higher plan. Life becomes valuable not because it leads somewhere, but because it is lived. Camus often used the phrase quantity over quality. He did not mean shallow indulgence. He meant that life should be filled with experiences rather than reduced to a single purpose. Love, art, friendship, work, struggle, and even pain all become ways of engaging with existence. None of them need to be eternal to matter. Absurdism also changes how we think about morality. Without divine commands or absolute values, ethics becomes grounded in human reality. Camus believed that if life is fragile and finite, then cruelty becomes more serious, not less. You cannot justify killing in the name of a future that may never come. You cannot excuse suffering by appealing to a plan you cannot prove. The only thing that matters is the reality of human lives here and now. This is why Camus opposed both nihilism and fanaticism. Nihilism denies value altogether. Fanaticism claims absolute value for an idea and sacrifices people to it. Absurdism rejects both. It says that life has no ultimate meaning, but that human beings still matter because they exist, because they suffer, and because they experience. Absurdism is therefore not a denial of meaning in a small sense. It is a refusal of absolute meaning. It rejects the idea that life must fit into a cosmic story to be worth living. It replaces that demand with a commitment to lucidity, presence, and human dignity. The absurd does not disappear when we accept it. It remains. But it no longer crushes us. It becomes the ground on which we stand. Absurdism becomes most clear when we see how it reshapes the idea of human purpose. In most philosophies, a person is defined by what they are meant to become. Religious systems tell us that life prepares the soul for eternity. Political ideologies tell us that individuals exist to serve history. Even many forms of existentialism suggest that people must create themselves as projects that move towards some final identity. Absurdism refuses all of this. It does not ask what a person is meant to become. It asks how a person lives while knowing that no final identity will ever be complete. This shift is subtle, but profound. It means that life is not a journey toward a final destination. It is a field of moments, each one existing for its own sake. There is no ultimate state in which everything suddenly makes sense. There is only the ongoing experience of being alive in a world that does not explain itself. Camus often described this condition as a kind of exile. Human beings feel as though they do not fully belong in the world they inhabit. They want the universe to feel like a home, but it feels instead like a place that tolerates them without recognizing them. Absurdism accepts this exile rather than trying to erase it. It says, yes, the world does not belong to you, and you do not belong to it in any metaphysical sense, and yet you are here. This acceptance changes how a person experiences even ordinary things. Work, for example, is often treated as a path to fulfillment, status, or security. But absurdism sees work as a repetition that does not lead to ultimate meaning. You work, you earn, you spend, you repeat. There is no final arrival. Instead of turning this into despair, absurdism asks you to see it clearly. The task does not have to be meaningful in a cosmic sense to be real. What matters is how you inhabit it. Are you conscious? Are you present? Are you awake to what you are doing? The same is true of relationships. Many people hope that love will give their lives final meaning. Absurdism does not deny the power of love, but it refuses to make it into a metaphysical solution. Love is intense because it is fragile. It matters because it will not last forever. To demand that love become eternal is to place an impossible burden on it. Absurdism, therefore, encourages a kind of fidelity to the moment. It does not say, nothing matters. It says, nothing is guaranteed. That distinction makes all the difference. When nothing is guaranteed, every moment becomes precious, not because it will last, but because it will not. This is why Camus' philosophy is often misread as bleak. It removes many of the comforting stories people use to explain their lives. But it also removes many of the chains those stories impose. If there is no final judgment waiting, you are free from the fear of cosmic failure. If there is no ultimate purpose you must fulfill, you are free to live according to what you actually experience. Absurdism is therefore a philosophy of honesty. It refuses to say that suffering is necessary, that injustice is meaningful, or that pain will be redeemed. It looks at the world and says, this is what it is. And then it asks how one can live well inside it. Camus's answer is not withdrawal. It is engagement. Absurdism does not lead to isolation or apathy. It leads to solidarity. When you realize that no higher power will make things right, the responsibility for justice falls on human beings. When you realize that life is fragile, you become more sensitive to the suffering of others. This is why Camus opposed ideological violence. Killing in the name of an abstract future is a way of denying the present reality of human life. Absurdism insists that nothing is more real than the person in front of you. No idea, no theory, no promised future can outweigh that. In this sense, absurdism becomes an ethics of limits. It does not say everything is permitted. It says nothing is permitted that denies human dignity. Because when there is no higher meaning to appeal to, the only thing left is the reality of lived experience. This brings us back to Sisyphus, the figure Camus chose to represent the absurd condition. Sisyphus is condemned to push his stone up the mountain forever. His labor never leads anywhere. His effort never changes his fate. From the outside, his life looks pointless. But Camus asks us to imagine Sisyphus in the moment when he walks back down the mountain. In that descent, Sisyphus knows the full truth of his situation. There is no hope that this time will be different. There is no hidden meaning in the repetition. There is only the task and the awareness of the task. And in that awareness, Sisyphus becomes free. The gods have given him a punishment, but they cannot take his consciousness. By seeing his condition clearly and accepting it without illusion, Sisyphus makes it his own. The stone is no longer simply an instrument of torture. It is the center of his life. The struggle belongs to him. This is what absurdism ultimately offers. Not escape from meaninglessness, but ownership of it. You do not have to pretend that life makes sense. You do not have to hope that it will one day be justified. You can live it, experience it, and stand inside it without apology. To live absurdly is not to be cynical. It is to be awake. It is to know that there are no final answers, and to refuse to be paralyzed by that knowledge. It is to keep pushing the stone, not because the summit holds meaning, but because the pushing is what you have. And perhaps that is Camus' most radical claim, that in a universe without guarantees, the simple act of living, consciously, honestly, without appeal, can itself be a form of defiance. Absurdism does not tell you why you exist. It tells you that you exist, and it asks what you will do with that fact. This is why Camus opposed both nihilism and fanaticism. Nihilism denies value altogether. Fanaticism claims absolute value for an idea and sacrifices people to it. Absurdism rejects both. It says that life has no ultimate meaning, but that human beings still matter because they exist, because they suffer, and because they experience. Absurdism is therefore not a denial of meaning in a small sense. It is a refusal of absolute meaning. It rejects the idea that life must fit into a cosmic story to be worth living. It replaces that demand with a commitment to lucidity, presence, and human dignity. The absurd does not disappear when we accept it. It remains. But it no longer crushes us. It becomes the ground on which we stand.